NATO is preparing for its most important transformation since the end of the Cold War. For decades, Europe's security rested on a simple assumption. If a major conflict broke out, the United States would carry most of the military burden. European countries would contribute, but Washington would remain the indispensable military power holding the alliance together. Now, that assumption is being challenged. Behind closed doors, NATO officials are discussing something increasingly known as NATO 3.0, a vision that could fundamentally reshape the transatlantic alliance and alter the balance of power across Europe. The idea sounds straightforward. Europe should take greater responsibility for its own defense, while the United States shifts more of its attention toward China and the Indo-Pacific. But beneath that simple idea lies a much bigger question. Can Europe actually defend itself without depending on American military power? And if the answer is no, what happens to NATO? To understand why this debate matters, we first need to understand how NATO reached this point. During the Cold War, NATO faced a clear threat: the Soviet Union. European countries maintained large armies, spent heavily on defense, and prepared for the possibility of a major war on the continent. The United States played a leading role, but European allies also carried a substantial share of the burden. Then the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. Europe enjoyed decades of relative peace. Governments redirected spending toward welfare programs, infrastructure, and economic development. Defense budgets shrank across much of the continent. Meanwhile, the United States remained the world's dominant military power. American taxpayers financed aircraft carriers, strategic airlift capabilities, missile defense systems, intelligence networks, satellites, logistics infrastructure, and nuclear deterrence capabilities that increasingly protected not only America, but also Europe. For many years, that arrangement worked. Today, however, Washington sees the world differently. American policymakers increasingly view China as their primary long-term competitor. The Indo-Pacific has become the center of strategic planning. Resources are finite. Military assets deployed in Europe cannot simultaneously support operations in Asia. That reality brings us to the first major development. NATO 3 is not really about defense spending, it is about strategic responsibility. Many observers focus on the headline figure. NATO members have agreed to move toward defense spending equal to 5% of GDP by 2035. But money alone does not solve the problem. The real issue involves military capabilities. Can Europe independently provide air defense systems, intelligence gathering, satellite support, long-range logistics, missile defense, cyber operations, and command structures at the scale currently provided by the United States? At the moment, the answer is largely no. European countries possess advanced militaries. France, Britain, Germany, Poland, Italy, and others maintain significant capabilities. But Europe still depends heavily on American support for many critical military functions. This means NATO's challenge is not simply spending more money, it is transforming money into military power. And that leads directly to the second development. Europe increasingly wants strategic autonomy. In simple terms, strategic autonomy means the ability to act independently when necessary. Since Donald Trump's first presidency, many European leaders have worried about relying too heavily on Washington. Those concerns intensified after Trump's return to the White House and his repeated demands that Europe assume greater responsibility for its own defense. As a result, the European Union has launched massive defense initiatives. The ReArm Europe Plan aims to mobilize up to 800 billion euros for defense investment. The SAFE initiative provides another 150 billion euros for joint procurement programs. European leaders are discussing missile defense systems, drone networks, military mobility projects, and even new defense institutions. French President Emmanuel Macron has gone further than most. For years, he has argued that Europe must become a genuine geopolitical power capable of defending itself. More recently, he suggested expanding France's nuclear deterrent to provide greater security guarantees for European partners. From Paris, this looks like strategic preparation. From Washington, some officials worry that Europe could create institutions that duplicate NATO rather than strengthen it. And that concern brings us to the third and most important development. Europe risks solving one problem by creating another. Many of the defense projects currently under discussion overlap with NATO's existing responsibilities. The European Air Shield, the European Space Shield, joint military commands, new defense structures. Each initiative may appear logical in isolation, but together they raise a critical question. Is Europe building a stronger European pillar inside NATO, or is it gradually building a parallel defense architecture outside NATO? The distinction matters enormously. NATO functions because it integrates dozens of countries into a single command structure. It coordinates planning, logistics, intelligence sharing, and military operations across the alliance. If European countries invest in capabilities that complement NATO, the alliance becomes stronger. If they build separate structures that compete with NATO, fragmentation becomes a real risk. This is precisely why countries such as Turkey continue emphasizing that European defense initiatives should remain inclusive and closely linked to NATO rather than evolving into exclusively EU-centered projects. Because once duplication begins, inefficiencies follow. And in military affairs, inefficiency can become dangerous very quickly. So what does all this mean for the future? For Europe, it means a historic shift in responsibility. The era of relatively low defense spending and heavy dependence on American military power is ending. European governments will need to spend more, produce more weapons, expand their defense industries, and develop capabilities they have neglected for decades. For the United States, NATO 3 offers an opportunity to redirect resources toward Asia without abandoning Europe entirely. Washington's goal is not to leave Europe defenseless. It is to transform the relationship from dependency into partnership. For Russia, the outcome matters enormously. A stronger Europe inside NATO would create a more capable and resilient alliance. A divided Europe pursuing competing security structures could create opportunities for Moscow to exploit political and strategic fractures. And for the rest of the world, this debate signals something even larger. The post-Cold War era is ending. For 3 decades, many countries operated under the assumption that American power would remain the central organizing force of global security. Today, allies increasingly prepare for a more multipolar world, a world where regional powers must carry greater responsibility for their own security. That is the real meaning of NATO 3. It is not simply a new defense policy. It is NATO's attempt to adapt to a world where American power remains essential, but no longer unlimited. If you want more in-depth analysis of the geopolitical shifts reshaping the world, make sure to subscribe to the International Desk.